This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 734 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. I've missed you guys. It feels good to be back. Now, during the regular season, I get questions all the time from people that are along the lines of, are you ready to admit that you were wrong about player X? To me, taking L's in the middle of the season doesn't do any good. And the same goes for any wins that I might have. Who's that helping at the end of the day? I'm trying to get some content out each week to help you guys win. If it's week 11 and I sit and dwell on things that I got right and wrong during the summer, it's kind of meaningless, right? Aren't you more concerned about who to pick up off the waiver wire? So I do this series of episodes each year. I do an episode that recaps the things that I predicted incorrectly across the previous season. And I follow that up with a show on the things that I got right. Being a fantasy football analyst means you're going to get a lot of things wrong. But there's no reason to just ignore that. You don't get better at anything by ignoring mistakes. And sometimes when you dig into the mistakes that you made, you realize that they weren't mistakes at all. Sometimes your process was just fine. So today, as I do each year, I'll be talking through some of the big things that I got wrong this season. I'll talk about what those things were and whether or not there was bad process involved in making the decisions that I made. Because in the end, process is what matters most. Now, before getting into the things that I got wrong, remember that with basketball season going strong, Wednesday nights are jam-packed with NBA action, and FanDuel and Buzzer plan on giving you a chance to win big with their daily fantasy basketball contest. Introducing the NBA Clutch Shot presented by Buzzer, an NBA DFS contest taking place every Wednesday from now until March that gives you a chance to win a share of FanDuel's biggest prize pool. Simply construct your best 9-player roster while staying under the salary cap and follow along as the games unfold using FanDuel's live scoring feature. Earn points for points scored, rebounds, assists, steals, and blocks, and watch as your lineup climbs the ranks. The higher up the leaderboard your lineup finishes, the more cash you'll win. It's that simple. The contest is live, so visit FanDuel.com/league/NBA-main-marquee-1 and submit your lineups now. That's FanDuel.com/league/NBA-main-marquee-1. When you think about me in this podcast and big misses in 2022, you probably would start with Elijah Moore. Everything that I work with data-wise pointed to Elijah Moore being a great player entering the 2022 season. He had a great fantasy points per game rate as a rookie. He had a good yards per route run rate. He was above the 95th percentile in my prospect model entering the NFL, which is a really good score. Everything was there. The Jets drafted Garrett Wilson, but I don't think Garrett Wilson can really be blamed for Elijah Moore's struggles. There's more to this. During Moore's rookie year, he had a 1.75 yards per route run rate. That was about a 65th percentile yards per route run among all rookie wide receivers since 2011 with 50 or more targets. Which, sure, that doesn't sound amazing, but you have to keep in mind that the sample there is filled with some really good rookies. We're only looking at rookie wide receivers with 50 or more targets, meaning they were likely pretty good to begin with. You're not seeing that volume if you're horrible. And Moore was in the 65th percentile in yards per route run among that group. Now here's something that's pretty crazy. Of our sample of rookie wide receivers with 50 or more targets, about 73% of them had 50 or more targets during their second season. The reason that number isn't higher is because the 2022 class hasn't played their second year yet. So we have this new sample of wide receivers. They're players since 2011 who saw 50 or more targets as a rookie and then 50 or more targets as a second-year player. Now keep in mind, Elijah Moore had a yards per route run rate of 1.75 as a rookie. As a second-year player, that number dropped to 0.9. So we essentially saw it get cut in half. In our sample of rookie wide receivers who had 50 targets in each of their first 2 seasons in the league, Moore's drop in yards per route run was by far the highest. We're talking over 80 wide receivers in this sample, and Elijah Moore effectively saw the biggest efficiency drop from one season to the next. And it really wasn't close. His drop in yards per route run was nearly 33% worse than the player who was second worst, which was Doug Baldwin. Baldwin's really the only player close to Moore who ended up having a good NFL career, too. Next to Baldwin are players like Jalen Reagor, Chris Givens, and Keelan Cole. So what does this all mean? Well, I'll say this first. If Elijah Moore didn't look good in my prospect model and then followed that up with a really effective rookie season, I wouldn't have been as high on him. But I was high on all the middle round second-year wide receivers. That's something that I talked about a lot last offseason. Those types of wide receivers tend to break out at an extremely high rate. And they did this year. Amon-Ra St. Brown and Devontae Smith were studs. Rashad Bateman got hurt, and Elijah Moore, he wasn't a stud. Process-wise, I'm not sure I would do anything dramatically different. This is a probability-driven game, and thinking this way allowed me to land Devontae Smith and Amon-Ra St. Brown in a lot of leagues. And you might remember me talking about those players being buy candidates after last year's draft, because their prices fell with their teams drafting or trading for good wide receivers. People didn't want Devontae Smith because they had A.J. Brown. People didn't want Amon-Ra St. Brown because they had Jameson Williams. Elijah Moore just happened to go in the opposite direction. Maybe some of it was his off-the-field stuff and his frustration with the team. And maybe some of it was the fact that Garrett Wilson is just a superior player. But the bottom line is that this was a miss. Sometimes players aren't as good as we originally think. But that doesn't mean the process was wrong. I'll continue to throw darts at that kind of profile all day long, because the reward, as we saw with St. Brown and Devontae Smith, can be huge. I had sort of a love-hate relationship with Josh Jacobs this year. I definitely wasn't drafting him much as his redraft ADP, which according to my fantasy league was 48th overall. So he was squarely a dead zone running back. Now, best ball was a little bit different of a story because his cost kept falling. But in the 4th round, I was out. And Jacobs ended up being the absolute best value at running back this year. Now, I look at expected fantasy points based on average draft position, which is essentially telling us how many fantasy points we'd expect a player to score at a certain ADP. Jacobs, at his ADP, would have been expected to score about 11.6 points per game. That's based on data over the last 11 years. But he scored 7.7 more points than that. And that difference ended up being the most at running back this year. So good job, JJ. Good effort. Now, the reason I have some love for this was because back on a 10 Trends episode earlier in the season, I had noted that Jacobs was starting to see a bell cow workload, that the receiving work started coming his way, and that he was a buy as a result. So hopefully people were able to take advantage of a buy low moment. In season, I feel good about how I reacted to Josh Jacobs. Out of season, not so much. I bought into what beat writers were saying out of Vegas, that this was going to be a committee backfield. That, combined with him being in the dead zone, made him a fade. We also had a pretty decent sample of him not being quite the bell cow back that we wanted him to be when he was drafted. And while I think that kind of reporting can be really helpful, I didn't put enough emphasis on talent within this situation. I like Zamir White as a prospect, but his profile was not totally complete. There were plenty of question marks. And the other guys in that backfield weren't special. Whereas we knew that Jacobs had the capital and the talent to be this guy. That was the mistake, and it's something I'm going to try to avoid moving forward. And for the record, I've seen a lot of people say the dead zone wasn't a thing this year because Josh Jacobs was really good and Travis Etienne was good and Breece Hall would have been a smash too. And while those guys did do well, Etienne still technically played slightly below expectation this year because of how he started the season. Etienne and Breece Hall were also 2 players that I picked out in my Beating the Running Back Dead Zone episode last summer. The running back dead zone is not foolproof. Not every single running back in the dead zone does poorly. But according to the ADP data that I work with, you still had players like J.K. Dobbins, Ezekiel Elliott, A.J. Dillon, Elijah Mitchell, Cam Akers, and David Montgomery in the dead zone. None of those players exceeded ADP expectation. The dead zone is a probability-driven thing, and it was still alive and well in 2022. Josh Jacobs, he beat it, and I was wrong to think that he wouldn't. It's wild to even think about this, but I thought that Chase Edmonds was a good value entering the season. And after his week 1 performance, I even doubled down on it. I said that he was a buy candidate. Because in week 1, he was seeing the usage that I thought he was going to see this year. He saw 2/3 of the team's running back rushes and a 13% target share. And then things just sort of crashed. The very next week, those numbers were more than cut in half, and the rest is history. Now, I never thought Chase Edmonds was a bad player. He had plenty of redeeming qualities as a receiving back. I think the issue with Edmonds here was being quick to double down on a small sample. Sometimes that works out, but I try to do that when we're talking about truly great talents. Like you heard me do that a lot this year with rookie wide receivers in particular. When it comes to a veteran running back who never truly capitalized on opportunity in the past, I should have been more careful. I still think Michael Pittman is a really good wide receiver, and his fantasy season really came down to situation, in my opinion. Pittman was someone that I was high on as a breakout, or someone who had a chance to be elevated to elite status. That breakout didn't happen. But not everything was horrible for him. He saw 141 targets and a target share per game rate of 26%. That's not only really high, but it was better than what he saw in 2021. But the way that offense operated was absolutely pathetic. There was a chance that Matt Ryan would elevate things, and all he did was turn Michael Pittman into a high floor, low ceiling option. Pittman's average depth of target this year dropped by 2.5 yards year over year. In 2021, almost 21% of his targets came 15 or more yards down the field. In 2022, that number was under 8%. It's going to be nearly impossible to be fantasy relevant with that low of an intermediate and deep ball rate. And what's interesting is that Pittman actually played relatively well for this situation. Since 2011, we've seen 36 wide receivers hit 50 targets and have a deep ball rate under 9%. Remember, Pittman was under 8%. Pittman's PPR points per game was second best on that list. His yards per team pass attempt was third best on the list. So all things considered, there was still some good that came from Pittman this year. We just have to hope that there's a tangible quarterback upgrade for this team next year. I'm still a believer in the talent, but I downplayed the situation for sure entering the season when Pittman was such a high draft pick. That's the thing. If he was a 4th or 5th rounder, it would have made more sense to not care about the situation. But he was often a late 2nd rounder. Though I will say, I'm not sure I would have ever predicted such bizarre usage. Now, speaking of situation, let's talk about Seattle, because I was not very high on DK Metcalf or Tyler Lockett entering the year. And the obvious reason as to why is pretty straightforward. It's Geno Smith. I love Geno Smith the person, but I had no idea he had this in him. Now, Metcalf wasn't as good in 2022 as he'd been with Russell Wilson. Let's get that out of the way. He scored just 6 times when he had touchdown totals of 12 and 10 during his 2 previous seasons. His target share per game rate was pretty in line with what he'd seen with Wilson, but he did see a slightly lower yards per route run rate. One of the things I wrote about in the late round draft guide this past summer was how Seattle was almost definitely going to run more plays per game this year than they did last year. I should have listened to my own advice with that, because they did run over 5 more plays per game. And then on top of that, they had a pass rate of 57%. It was 54% the year prior. What that meant was more targets for Metcalf and Lockett. Metcalf had a similar target share, but his target total jumped by 12. And because Geno Smith ended up being so much more accurate than we all thought, Metcalf had a better catch rate. He ended the season with a career high 90 receptions. So his PPR points per game did drop, but it didn't drop to the point where he'd become irrelevant. And it was sort of similar with Tyler Lockett. Lockett actually had pretty similar numbers across the board as he saw the previous season. It was as if Russell Wilson never left Seattle. Now, I've done studies on middle round wide receivers, and those studies show that quarterback play by ADP doesn't matter. It matters much more for tight ends. We knew Metcalf and Lockett were good players, so in hindsight, it made plenty of sense to load up on them regardless of their situation. Because unlike Michael Pittman, a player like DK Metcalf wasn't getting drafted in the early rounds. The opportunity cost wasn't nearly as significant. He was an early 5th round pick. He outscored his expected points per game by 0.4 points per contest. And with Tyler Lockett, Lockett outscored it by 4.4 points per game. So the moral of the story is this: trust team regression on the plays run front. And don't worry so much about situation with players drafted outside the early rounds. It made sense to worry more for a player like Pittman. But when the opportunity cost is lower and you know the players are talented, you should be able to brush it off more easily. Now, of course, Geno Smith playing out of his mind versus expectation helped with all of this. But we need to be more open-minded in the preseason to those types of things happening. It's easy to be overly confident in how you think a team season is going to go down. I was in on Allen Robinson too, and woo, that was wrong. My logic for Robinson was that 2021 was just a weird year for him. Whether talking injury or COVID, he was literally a year removed from a 100 reception season, and he'd done all that with poor quarterback play. Now, the Rams' offense this year was bad in general, and the offensive line was a big reason for that. He didn't get to do what the Rams wanted him to do. His average depth of target in 2022 was the lowest of his career. He saw a 15-plus air yard target at just a 13.5% rate. That was by far the lowest rate of his career. He'd typically been in the 25 to 30% range. So all that compounded, yes. But I do think it's also important to be a little bit more hesitant about players like him who are coming off objectively horrible seasons. I mean, in 2021, Robinson had a yards per route run rate of 1.13. He somehow was even worse in 2022. But when you combine that with a wide receiver age curve in hindsight, it made sense to see Robinson as overvalued, even with this improved situation. So hand me that L for Allen Robinson. I wasn't into Josh Allen at his ADP because I preferred the Jalen Hurts tier more. So missing out on Josh Allen's season, yeah, it's a loss. It was a bad call. But I did that at the cost of drafting a player who was just as good and he was cheaper in Jalen Hurts. I just like that tier more. So it was an L, but it also wasn't totally an L at the same time. Instead of focusing today on Allen, I want to look at someone who I definitely got wrong, which was Joe Burrow. It sounds weird to say that I wasn't high on Burrow, because obviously Burrow's a monster. But one of the things I wrote about and talked about with Burrow entering last year was his high touchdown rate in 2021. It was 6.5%. Usually touchdown rates that high regress, and his did. He was at 5.8% this year. Now in 2021, Burrow also had a lot of unsustainable touchdowns. 16 of his touchdowns were on 15-plus air yard throws. That was the second highest mark that we'd seen from any quarterback since 2011. The Bengals were bound to be more pass-heavy in 2022 than they were in 2021, yes. But my thinking and my projections showed this too, was that the potential dip in touchdown rate and big play touchdowns would sort of combat the rise in pass rate. And since he had 19.6 points per game in 2021, my thought was that with people being very, very high on him after his Super Bowl run, if he matched that score at his ADP, he wouldn't necessarily be a league-winning quarterback. He did better than that, though. Burrow exceeded his 2021 numbers by a little over 2 points per game. The crazy part is, though, is that the things I thought would happen sort of did happen. Like I said, his touchdown rate dropped. He also had half the number of big play touchdowns that he had in 2021. And the Bengals did pass more. What I didn't account for was better rushing numbers. That was really the difference. Burrow scored 2 more points per game on the ground this past year than he did in 2021. And his rush share in the Bengals offense was twice as high. And honestly, this could have been because of the ACL recovery. That was definitely something I overlooked when projecting Burrow in 2022. Otherwise, the projection really wasn't that far off. But it was wrong. I should have been higher on Burrow. I don't know if we'd consider Burrow league winning this year because according to ADP expectation and how he actually performed, he was the 4th best value at quarterback behind Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, and Justin Fields. But he was definitely someone who you loved having on your roster. Now, the last guy I want to mention on today's episode, TJ Hawkinson. My argument against Hawkinson had to do with a few things. Number one, a lot of people were blaming Hawkinson's absence for Amon-Ra St. Brown's emergence during his rookie season. But that didn't make much sense to me because Hawkinson himself had never proven to be some elite tight end. He was good, but he had never done anything like St. Brown did during the end of his rookie season. So I liked St. Brown, and that bumped down Hawkinson. Number two, middle round tight ends generally are not providing huge breakout seasons. This is an ADP trend. And on top of that, middle round tight ends with bad quarterbacks by ADP very rarely were worthwhile in fantasy. Keep in mind, when we were drafting Hawkinson, he was playing for the Lions. According to my numbers, Hawkinson ended up outperforming ADP by 2.5 PPR points per game this year, which is very good. But given the way people are talking about him right now, that's not nearly as high as you might expect. Now, it was still bad advice for me to say that he wasn't a good pick at ADP. For instance, I had mentioned that I liked Dallas Goedert more than TJ Hawkinson. And Hawkinson ended up scoring a little bit more points per game, and he was better versus expectation than Dallas Goedert was. So what happened? Well, what happened was that Hawkinson was traded straight up. That trade was everything for him. Now, you can look at his splits in Detroit versus Minnesota and say, but JJ, he averaged 12.2 points per game in Detroit. That's still good. Well, he also had a 40-point performance that's helping raise that average. Now, that performance counts. It's part of what Hawkinson did this season. But when you look at his other 6 games in Detroit this year, Hawkinson averaged 7.6 PPR points per game. For some context, that's what Kyle Pitts averaged this year. Even in Minnesota, Hawkinson had that monster Week 16 game. That buoyed his average up a little bit too. But in Minnesota, he was seeing more volume. His target share per game rate rose by 6 percentage points if you remove the worthless Week 18. And that's typically what we see with better quarterback play, and why the quarterback ADP trend exists with tight ends. I talked about this research in the offseason a lot, but tight ends with better quarterbacks by ADP tend to perform better. And Cousins was an upgrade by that metric. Had Hawkinson started the season with Cousins, he wouldn't have been the same type of player to avoid. But look, Hawkinson had an awesome season. He had a great wildcard playoff game. He's a really good player, and I definitely took an L with him this year, even if the things that happened with him weren't totally predictable. Now, I want you to know that I'm fully aware that there were more things that I got wrong this year. I thought the players that I highlighted today, though, were some of the more glaring misses. Hopefully you ended up learning as much as I did going back through them. Next week's going to be a little bit easier on me because I'm going to be looking at the things that went my way. But that's it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Now, before I let you go, I want to let you all know that this year's Late Round Prospect Guide is now available for pre-order over on LateRound.com. I'm really proud of last year's guide. I'm excited for this year's. In it, you're going to get an in-depth background about what goes into my prospect models, and then I profile every single running back and wide receiver that's going to be at the NFL Combine. You'll get their pre-draft percentile scores from the model, and then when the draft concludes, you'll get an updated version of the guide showing their post-draft scores. And there's rankings littered throughout it too. But there's more. The prospect guide also includes a breakdown of my year 2 model, along with profiles for relevant running backs and wide receivers who are going to be entering the second year of their NFL career. So that section's going to help you know what to do with someone like Dameon Pierce, or Treylon Burks, or George Pickens. All of those players will be profiled for you, and I'll talk about what to do with them in Dynasty. If you pre-order the guide before its launch on March 13th, you can get it for $11.99. It's a PDF that gets delivered to your email. Once the official guide launches on March 13th, the price will jump to $14.99. So you can pre-order it today, right now, over on lateround.com. And when the guide is ready with pre-draft information, it's going to hit your inbox, and that'll be on March 13th. Thanks for listening, everyone. Really appreciate it. I'll talk to you later in the week with the weekly mailbag show.